Hello everyone, and welcome to an Animal Rights Show special. We love you so much that we've got 2 countdowns. Hey, here we are. So, smooth as what, Wendy? Smooth as what?
Vegan silk.
No, we said it was smooth as a baby's bum last time.
Oh, did we?
Oh my god. Hello everyone.
I've had a few sleeps since then.
Welcome to a special. So we weren't supposed to be here, but we've got a very special guest panelist. So Laura,
one of our favorite
welcome
guests
back,
ever.
Laura.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you. I am so thrilled and so honored to be here. And I was just saying, just before we began, I love talking on the Animal Rights Show because, I love the sort of informality and the, kind of spontaneity of the whole setup and everything. And as we were saying, that's totally in spirit with the anarchist way of doing things. So I'm really, really thrilled and honored to be back.
Okay, Laura, you can stop now. The check's in the post.
And we are very excited about today's topic.
I'm super excited about today's topic. It's actually a theory that I've been developing for a while that kind of was inspired by combining basically kind of like this sort of long-standing idea on the broader left, on the socialist left, of a post-scarcity society. A society where we don't need to be struggling to survive. We don't need to be fearing want all the time. A truly liberated society from scarcity. Hello, Benny. I saw that note pop up. And then specifically, Murray Bookchin's idea. Now, Murray Bookchin was not a vegan or an animal liberationist, but he was a social ecologist. So he was looking at things through an ecological lens and combining that with socialist and anarchist theory and this idea of post-scarcity anarchism. How anarchism might be possible and to move us into a post-scarcity society and also be possible in a post-scarcity society. And then combining that with the idea of veganarchism, which of course was originally presented by Brian Dominic, this idea of combining veganism and anarchism to move us into a post-scarcity society.
So that's what we've got to come. But Laura, we haven't seen you for ages. So what the devil have you been up to?
Let's see. Of course, I am working with the Institute for Critical Animal Studies as their director of regions and total liberation. So I organized 2 conferences for them in the past couple of months, and they were both really quite amazing. One of them was on the subject of eco-ability, which is a conference that they have every year. And that conference, that's basically to kind of talk about new work that's being done in the field of eco-ability. So the field of eco-ability is, looking at intersections of how disability justice relates to ecology and animal liberation, from a total liberationist perspective, which is what the Institute for Critical Animal Studies is really all about, is, human, animal, other species, and earth liberation. And then another conference for them, that was a regional conference for what is called North America, or as I call North American occupied Turtle Island. For those who don't know, Turtle Island is the indigenous name or an indigenous name for what we now call North America. And that was also an amazing conference. And actually we had an indigenous speaker, Abundia Alvarado, and she talked about some issues, with indigenous resistance and land reclamation. And we had all kinds of speakers that were kind of coming, from different angles, including some very interesting anarchist ones. Of course, the Institute for Critical Animal Studies is an anarchist organization as well. So I've been involved with that, and I'm actually also working on a chapter for a new book that is going to be coming out on the topic that I'm going to be speaking about today, specifically. And that's a very interesting project because it's actually, the whole book is about kind of radical new directions for the field of critical animal studies. Where can that field go, and more moving forward. So that's a piece that I have been working on, where I've been developing those ideas. And then, of course, I continue to work with Plant the Land team. They are based in Gaza. I co-founded that with a local Gazan activist who is a superhero, Anas Arafat. That's a vegan food justice team and community projects team organized by and for local Palestinians in Gaza. So again, all of this is kind of coming back to this idea in a way of veganarchism, because mutual aid is a central tenet of anarchism. And one of the really exciting things that I think is going on in the vegan movement, and that I am very thrilled and proud to be a part of, is this idea of veganizing mutual aid, right? So providing support and solidarity for people who need it, but doing it in a vegan way. And of course, with the vegan ethics that go along with that. So,
well, Laura, basically, you've been sitting with your feet up, really. Not
doing
so
nothing.
much at all. You're literally like Superwoman.
Yeah, twiddling your thumbs.
Twiddling your thumbs, feet up, Netflix on.
Hey, but Nella and Wendy, how cool must it be to be able to say that you're the director of Total Liberation?
Oh my God! Yeah. Oh, amazing!
I know, that's just.
Actually, I'll admit that I kind of fought for that title to stay there, because I am director of regions now, and it was almost a question of like, well, are you going to still be director of Total Liberation, or are you going to be director of regions? And I was like, no, I have to be Total Liberation director. So it's like, and director of regions and Total Liberation.
Because if you can be anything in this world, that's the thing you should be. I mean,
Yeah.
Total Liberation.
Yeah, I was like, we got to keep that Total Liberation in the title.
Although,
Right,
should we have a director of that, or is that anarchical, or is that still allowed? Are we still allowed directors in an anarchical?
Oh, I think
society?
he's a facilitator.
Yeah.
I think that is such a good question, Wendy. Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole thing about anarchism is that, like, anybody can be a director, or anybody can start, their own project. I mean, we could call it director, we could call it facilitator, we could call it organizer, we could call it lots of different names. But, the way I see it is that's kind of like my function, or my focus is total liberation. But really, I mean, everybody who's involved in these super critical animal studies, their focus is total liberation, right? Because that's the ultimate goal. So, yeah.
I think we've got your number, Laura. I think you're dictator of Total Liberation. So
she wants total power. She's power hungry.
Yeah. You're going to be liberated, and you're going to like it right now.
That's kind of the ultimate oxymoron. I am the dictator of total liberation. I will force you to be liberated.
Now, before we get on with the order of the day, I just want to mention again that Mel Broughton has been either. You might know this more than me. Wendy's refused bail or remanded in custody anyway, and so he's gonna be in over Christmas and New Year. So if you were to drop a line, then that would be most welcome for him, I'm sure. So he's in the Peterborough Nick as we speak. So get out soon, Mel. That's all we can say, and keep away from the heavies on the hunt as soon as you do, which is another thing we ought to say. So because Mel's been through quite a lot in the last year. Must have been his most dramatic year, really, because he's either been arrested or he's been in hospital because he's been beaten up.
He's had a rough time, bless him. Yeah,
So many
such a
times.
dedicated activist. Yeah, wishing you well, Mel. Not that you can hear this right now, but.
So, Laura, should we begin?
Okay.
Okie dokie. So let's bring this up. So we've got a PowerPoint. I think we've got about 12 slides, and I'll change them as you dictate. Being a dictator of total liberation, Laura. So
The only thing I'm a dictator of is my own PowerPoint presentation.
a dictator of PowerPoint. Yeah, that's
A dictator of PowerPoint.
Power. See, it's even got power in the title. Power.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think all this anarchy thing is just a fraud, don't you, Wendy?
Oh, Laura, we're only pulling your
No,
leg.
never. It's our only hope.
No, you're right, though. There is something quite funny about the fact that it's, power. Don't put the ideas in my head.
Power to the people.
Exactly. Empower. So we're going to do
the power, right?
presentation. Yeah, that's great. I love that, actually. We're going to do an PowerPoint presentation. Cargill going down. Yeah, fight the power. So yeah, I loved this image, right? Because it really does express something that I think is quite profound as a veganarchist message, which is, and specifically a post-scarcity one, right? Because you can see that this is kind of like in the aftermath of the collapse. And the implication is kind of like, I don't know if this was the artist's idea or intention to depict just the collapse of animal agribusiness, but I would say that, we could talk about the wider idea of the collapse of capitalism on the whole. And, I love also this idea of them, with this abundance, right? They're eating this, obviously vegan meal. The animals are there to join them. They're all free. And so I really felt like that kind of encapsulated a lot of the ideas behind how veganarchism might usher us into a post-scarcity society. But also in some ways be only possible, of course, in a post-scarcity society in a way, because there is this idea of, and I mean, every vegan knows this, right? There's always this idea of, but what would you do if you were stranded on a desert island or you didn't have, enough plant-based, right? Oh, what if you had to, hunt for your subsistence and this sort of thing? And so, you can look at post-scarcity in both regards of, we have to have a post-scarcity society to have a veganarchist society, but then we also have to, in a way, have a veganarchist society to have a post-scarcity society. So it kind of goes both ways with that. So I guess we can continue.
Yeah, just before we move on, anybody else noticed the little dog there? It's got a brilliant look on his face. Have you seen the little dog there?
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? Or she.
Right. Okie dokie. Here we go.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of real scarcity to start off with, this question of what is scarcity. And we're going to also talk a little bit about why this is not entirely what most people think about kind of this history of scarcity. So we have, of course, in the image, you know, this kind of like stereotypical image of, you know, the man and the woman appearing to be anyway. You know, they're looking all, you know, naked practically, and they're, you know, wrapped up in animal skins, and they've got no shoes, and they, you know, have no food. And, you know, this is kind of like the stereotyped idea of what a lot of people think when they think of Paleolithic society or, you know, more ancient society in that way. We can go on. So the historical dynamics of scarcity and the formation of hierarchy. Now, for anyone who is not that familiar with anarchist ideology, basically hierarchy is the key word that you want to pay attention to, because that's really at the root of what anarchists believe, is that the problems, all of the problems in society in terms of systems of oppression and domination and exploitation, right? They all come down to this core issue of hierarchy. Now, if you are a veganarchist, then you don't stop that where humans and other species begin. You see that as a natural continuation of, if hierarchy and domination is wrong, if one individual over another or over others having power over them is wrong, then it's wrong when humans do it to other animals, and it's wrong when humans do it to the earth. So this is about the formation of hierarchy in the first place, some ideas about that. So basically, there's the idea that historically humanity faced ongoing real shortages of the basics of life: food, clothing, shelter, water, survival being a chronic struggle. And nature was the primary determinant of whether there was scarcity or abundance originally. Now, of course, this is before hierarchy, right? So if you have a group of humans and there is no hierarchy of one having power over the others, then the only thing that's going to determine whether everyone has enough or not is the actual natural world, right? If you have a drought, you probably wouldn't want to stay in that location. You'd want to pick up and leave because you wouldn't be able to survive there. Or if there are storms, you know, or an earthquake, or, you know, this sort of thing. But it's not going to be a question of somebody hoarding the resources and there not being enough because somebody's controlling them. So originally, nature was the determinant of whether there was scarcity or abundance. Now, the idea that anthropologists have had of how this may have started to change is that religions and spiritual belief systems formed in response to this chronic scarcity. And they promised that they had a direct connection to the gods or goddesses who would provide the ecological conditions to meet the needs of the people upon their request. So they kind of positioned themselves as a middleman or middle person and said, well, you know, if you want conditions to change, you got to go through me because I'm the one that has the direct hookup to the powers that be that can control the weather conditions and this sort of thing. And when that didn't happen, the priestly class would claim that this was because the gods were angry with the people for behaving in quote unquote sinful ways. Of course, they were, of course, determining what these sinful ways were because, again, they were positioning themselves as the middle person that had the direct connection, right? Yeah, very fear-based, exactly. So therefore, if the people wanted the gods to respond favorably, they needed to obey the commands of the priests, the monarchs, and the ruling class. And And this usage of scarcity as a tool of control was born, right? So this idea of we can make the people behave by controlling their access to what they need to survive. And, eventually, that wasn't just controlling the populations in general, but more specifically to make them work for those that had that control and power to expand their power and their wealth, right? So this became a tool of social control. And then that became exacerbated because what would happen is that invading warlords would promise the invaded populations protection from scarcity and from future invasions, provided they labor to produce food and other goods for the warlords, some of which was then paid to military personnel who could then control the invaded populations, who became the peasants as well. And this is basically how the system of government and taxation was formed. Now, there are some very, very interesting theories about how domination over other animals actually played a major role in this. So, for example, there's David Nybert's book, which is Animal Oppression, Human Violence. And then the subheader is Domesticration, Capitalism, and Global Conflict. And in that book, he actually talks about how the warlord societies that would invade, of course, they were the herder societies, they were pastoralist, and they were the ones that were first controlling and dominating and exploiting the bodies of large mammals. And for that reason, number one, they always needed a lot more land because they needed pasture and water constantly for the animals. But the other thing was that made them very successful invaders because, number one, they developed a lot of tools of domination and subjugation that they would use to control the animals that they then would use on the populations that they invaded. And the other thing was that they had horses, and those horses moved very quickly. And so they could zoom into an area and take control. And, the human population would not be able to do anything about it because the horses were almost like military tanks would be in this day and age, that they would just zoom in there and zoom out. And so, there was already starting to be a very strong connection between these things at that time. But these warlords that would come in, again, they would really set up then this system of really a false scarcity, because the people that had been living on that land, that had been able to produce their own food, were suddenly, that land was controlled by someone else. And the controllers, who were the invaders, would then restrict the access that the original people had on that land. And that is actually really the origins of the whole system of feudalism, the whole system of land ownership. So, there's this big connection between, and the system of enslavement came from that as well, because the warlords then would enslave the populations that they invaded. So there's this huge connection between ownership of land, ownership of other animals, and ownership of other humans. And that's really at the core of all of these issues that have kind of sprung into these major systems of oppression today. And so again, if we look at this within the context of the origins of hierarchy, we're going to look at the root of all of these different issues of oppression, of scarcity, of systems of domination and exploitation, etc. So we can continue. So now we have capitalism's con of manufactured scarcity. And actually, I just want to say, before we continue into this part of the presentation, someone who really is worth looking into the theories of is Marshall Sahlins, because he was an anthropologist that kind of pushed back against this idea that there was always scarcity. And his theory was that actually the original Paleolithic societies, so the forager societies, they did not have scarcity because they could just pick up and move from place to place. They were sharing everything. And, so if there was a problem, if there was some sort of environmental catastrophe or something, they could just pick up and leave because they didn't have a lot of possessions. And his theory was actually that was very deliberate on their part, because they were aware that the more you have these sorts of possessions and ownership and this sort of thing, the more you are at the mercy of the forces of scarcity. And he cited actually as evidence of this forager societies of today that were surrounded by communities that were living in the more rooted materialist way, but that they chose not to do that because they knew that was actually going to ironically entrap them and cause them more scarcity. So hierarchy really was kind of like the origins of scarcity. But then we get into more advanced systems or devolved systems, I would say, of scarcity. And so capitalism actually creates scarcity deliberately in order to make profits from that. So I have a picture here, of course, of somebody throwing out massive amounts of food because even though that food is perfectly good and perfectly ethical, God forbid they provide it to people for free that need it, or even animals, right? But, they throw it out because they don't want to lower the, they want to construct that it's worth more in price. So we can continue. So capitalism's claim to legitimacy is that it supposedly eliminates scarcity through its system of mass production. However, due to capitalism's supply and demand-based pricing system, creating false shortages is financially profitable, since an abundance of supply and insufficient demand equals price devaluation. So perfectly usable goods are often deliberately destroyed in order to drive up prices while people suffer and even die for lack of these necessities. Food and other commodities experience price hikes due to speculators deliberately driving up prices to make a profit on the stock exchange. That was a horrifying situation that happened actually during the Great Recession, where they purposely drove up the prices of commodities, and people starved for that reason. I would say that that's probably happening at the moment as well, with all of this mass inflation. So, I mean, this is a manufactured scarcity. It's not that we don't have the resources that are needed to provide for everyone, but rather that, again, it's that control issue of access. So they want to control the resources and not let people who need them have access to them in order to create higher profits for them. Poverty itself is manufactured scarcity. This is one of those things that is so obvious when you think about it, and yet hardly anyone ever does think about it. Because the only thing that's stopping poor, in quotes, people from being able to move about freely and take about what they need is, again, hierarchy, power differentials within human society. So some people have the power to control the resources, and other people do not have the power to access the resources. So centralized control of resources is the issue, not insufficient resources. That's the cause of poverty. And this, of course, includes the centralized control of the ability to manufacture money. Money is a construct. It is a construct that was actually invented during the Neolithic period. Again, the warlords actually were the first ones to create this concept of money in order to tax the populations that they controlled. And again, this was always something that was used to control and manipulate people. This ongoing state of manipulated false scarcity is then used to create a chronic, insecure mindset of fear, right, which somebody mentioned earlier, competitiveness, and lack in the population, leading them to do everything from hoard consumer goods to accept low-wage jobs, support austerity cuts, support cruel anti-immigration policies, support wars, support punitive so-called justice, and oppose efforts to regulate or eliminate the worst capitalist industries for fear of loss of jobs. I also want to mention something that I'm just thinking of now, which is, when you think of this in terms of resistance to veganism, one of the biggest things that I've heard a lot of is kind of this idea of like, life is misery, for working class people. They're suffering, they're ground down, by the system. And it's like the one thing they look forward to that they can access, what is it? Very often it's food, right? And very often it's animal-based foods in quotes. Again, this is all coming from this like scarcity mode of operating, right? Because if you have scarcity of time, which labor takes up your time, right? If you have scarcity of energy, if you have scarcity of freedom or joy in your life, you're going to cling on to those creature comforts a lot more tightly than if you are living in a state of liberation and abundance. So that's another aspect of this that I would say we might want to consider.
Well, so Laura, I don't know, have you heard of because when I was reading the slides earlier and stuff, it just brought to mind something that's going on at the moment with all the kind of cost of living crisis and all the power outages that have been happening, food shortages and things like that. There's a movement called preppers. Have you heard of this? So it's people who are, I think it started in North American occupied turtle land. What is it you call it? I think it started there. It's also in the UK now as well, and probably, I don't know, Nella, if it's in Greece or Roger, if you've heard of this in Ireland as well, but it's preppers, and it's basically a movement that started to prepare for things like this, for scarcity, obviously with all the wars that are going on and everything. So it's people are stockpiling food, basically, lots of like tinned and dried foods, equipment like torches or battery powered lamps and things like that, and just there are more and more people going out to these like hardware stores and really stocking up on all these kind of emergency supplies, and in case all this stuff happens. And there's a real growing movement of this. So it's happening right in front of our eyes. Everything you're talking about.
Yes, you're so exactly right to bring that up in that context, because that's exactly right. It's a fear of scarcity, right? Now, the interesting thing about the preppers movement is that preppers and anarchists, are both kind of looking at this sort of potentially dystopian future in that way, where they're saying, wow, we're looking at climate change, we're looking at ecological collapse, we're looking at, mass social unrest, we're looking at all of these different factors that could lead us to an actual scarcity future, and future where like all of the systems sort of collapse. But the big difference is that the preppers are looking at this in a very individualist way, and they're just looking at it in the way of, I got to protect myself and my maybe my family in most cases, at most. I wouldn't even say typically my community, but I mean that would be as far as it goes, if at all. But it's very much this idea of, I've got to save my own skin and those that are the closest to me. And the unspoken sort of flip side to that is everybody else can kind of go to hell. Whereas, the social anarchists are looking at this and they're saying, well, this is really where we collectively need to be building a new system that is going to support the needs of humanity. And, of course, when you have like the eco-anarchists and the veganarchists, it's, and that are also going to support the needs of the other species and the planet. But it is a different response to the same crisis that both are seeing.
It isn't weird though, because it happens just after the COVID crisis, where it was very obvious that how much we need mutual aid. Like large numbers of people survived only because they were the anarchist group going every day. I know that this happened here in Greece, it happened in the UK, obviously it happened everywhere. People survived just because they were the soup kitchens, they were volunteers going around with medicines and food, taking care of vulnerable people. So it became suddenly very obvious that we cannot survive without mutual aid. Mutual aid is survival. And then you have this individualistic movement just after the COVID crisis, like we never learned from our mistakes.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, this is the thing, is that COVID obviously caused a crisis, and and it's very interesting about mutual aid, which comes up later in my presentation, but I'll mention it here because the whole idea of mutual aid originally came from the anarchist philosopher and naturalist Peter Kropotkin. And does anybody know where Kropotkin got the idea of mutual aid from?
Other animals.
That's right. Yeah, from observing other species and how they take care of their communities. That's what's so fascinating and amazing and inspiring for the animal liberation movement with this, is that literally when we engage in vegan mutual aid efforts, we are actually taking inspiration from them. And he literally called the book Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution, because he was responding to Darwin's, social Darwinism specifically, but this idea of nature being, cutthroat and survival of the fittest. And then he looked at nature and he said, oh my God, no, that's not at all how they operate. They take care of each other and they have solidarity with each other and cooperate and community and all this sort of thing. So, and, so like COVID created this crisis, and mutual aid then became much more of a mainstream idea. Before that, really only anarchists spoke about mutual aid, but now it's a term that a lot of people are familiar with. And it was very interesting because, when everything shut down, that actually really allowed anarchist movements to flourish in a lot of ways, because they didn't have the usual systems and structures in place to prevent those things from happening, right? They didn't have all the, the red tape and the regulations and, and the normal business activities. So for example, you had like a lot of spaces that normally would be businesses, but because they were shut down, they would say, as we're a restaurant, you can use our kitchen, anarchists who have a mutual aid effort, or you can use our space, because everything was shut down. So there's a term that some people might be familiar with, that Naomi Klein, the political theorist Naomi Klein, who has written a lot on anarchist ideas as well. Her book No Logo was a big inspiration for the anarchist influenced anti-globalization movement around the turn of the millennium. But she wrote a book called Shock Doctrine. Is anybody familiar with this book?
No.
Okay, so the book's premise is that, when there's a crisis, capitalism and kind of like the powers that be, the ruling class, the hierarchy, the power structure, will often seize on that crisis and use that as an excuse to expand their power, to expand their overreach, to take away people's rights and freedoms. COVID was used in that way in many ways. I could also say something like, for example, September 11th. That was a big one, right? Oh, we have to fight terrorism, so we have to take away people's rights and surveil them. And, but we're doing this for your protection. And of course, the scam goes all the way back to the warlords, back in the Neolithic era, who would say, oh, you have to obey us because if not, somebody else will invade you, right? But anarchists kind of, used that crisis in a positive way. And I think that this is something that we can also do as an animal liberation movement and really should be doing where COVID is concerned, because you can use the crisis to say, hey, this is an opportunity for us to kind of like put our ideas out there and to try to implement strategies that are going to actually empower humanity, empower other animals, and to move this towards a liberated world. And the last thing I'll say about this is with COVID is that, on the one hand, you had like the COVID crisis kind of opening up opportunities for anarchist ideas and mutual aid efforts and all this sort of thing. But also, let's look at COVID as a shock doctrine for the vegan movement, because of course, where did COVID come from? What caused COVID? I don't mean geographic location, but what caused COVID? What causes plagues like COVID?
Exploitation of other animals.
These are the zoonotic diseases, right? They come from animal exploitation. So it's like that could be a shock doctrine for us in a way, but not a shock doctrine. It would, it'd have to be a positive thing, but it's a positive shock doctrine in a way. It's a way of kind of like using a crisis to say, hey, let's look at the way that we've been living. Let's look at the oppressive things that we've been doing that have caused this crisis. And let's look at new ways of being in the aftermath of this. Obviously, the climate collapse is another one, but all of these are things where they can actually open up opportunities. Obviously, they open up opportunities for the ruling class, but they can also open up opportunities for us if we respond to them wisely and actively. So yeah, we can continue. So now we have the dawn of what is sometimes called the Capitalocene, or sometimes called the Anthropocene, where we are actually facing real scarcity. Maybe in some ways for the first time in human history, actually, because we are getting to the stage where the Earth may not be able to sustain to meet the basic needs of the species on it. And obviously that does not just involve the human species or include the human species. It's other species as well that are now facing an Earth that is a real scarcity situation where it's not able to sustain their basic needs. So we can continue. So very shocking, disturbing information that I was finding as I was doing the research for this. So we're looking at food shortages, water shortages, energy shortages, biodiversity shortages, inhabitable land shortages, and breathable air shortages. So as of right now, we are facing Earth running out of fresh water in as little as 18 years. If you are having a baby right now, by the time they are graduating high school or entering into their young adult life, there may be no water, no fresh water. By 2025, we're entering 2023 here, up to 3.5 billion people could be living in water-scarce regions versus 1 billion today. We have 8 billion people on this planet, so we are talking about heading for half the world's population not having sufficient water. International Water Management Institute estimates nearly every country south of the 35 north latitude, so that's basically the entire global south, will experience economic or physical water scarcity by 2025. Population increases will require 35% more food, 40% more water, and 50% more energy by 2030. Industrial water demand is set to grow 400% by 2050. This is, of course, in a world where we will have no fresh water in 18 years. By 2030, only 10% of the world's forests will remain. Climate change could slash food productions by up to 1/3 across Africa for the next 60 years. 150 to 200 million climate refugees will need to vacate their homes due to rising sea levels within the next 80 years, and burning fossil fuels at this causes us to reach 2 degrees Celsius rise by 2036. 2 degrees Celsius rise is basically the temperature where that is the point of no return. There is no going back after that. It kind of takes on a life of its own, of the planet heating uncontrollably. Very serious crisis situation. And obviously, it goes without saying that anything that's affecting humans in this way is affecting other species in this way too. All of these are animal rights issues because animals have the right, other animals have the right to clean drinking water that they depend on to survive, habitats, all of the things that they need to survive are obviously just as much under threat as our survival is under these circumstances. So we can continue. So right now we are in this strange place where we are at the crossroads of continuing manufactured scarcity, but then at the same time also real scarcity. We have 100 million people in the throes of famine in Southeast Africa right now. We have record numbers of people worldwide moving towards starvation, the UN warns. And I actually included some pictures of some places that are going through famines that are a combination actually of both, because we have Yemen, and on the one hand, there is a water shortage in that part of the world. But on the other hand, we have the US-backed Saudi war that is taking control of their farmlands. And one of the major reasons why, very relevant to animal liberations and veganism, is that because of the water shortage, because of the droughts, because of climate change, which is a real scarcity issue, Saudi Arabia does not have enough water to grow feed crops for their cows that they exploit for milk. And Saudi Arabia has a big dairy industry. And so that is actually one of the major drivers of why they are attacking Yemen and taking their farmlands. And of course, because of this, that is causing horrific famine in Yemen. Actually, the UN has said that, I'm getting the comment, I'm not ready, nor will I ever be for this kind of future. This is why we need to work now to stop this from happening, right? Yeah, no one is ready for this. So yeah, I mean, Yemen is now, actually the UN has called it arguably the worst human rights crisis since the Nazi Holocaust. And yet, most people don't even know that this is going on. Certainly, they don't know the dairy component to it, the animal agribusiness component to it. And of course, in US occupied Turtle Island, most US Americans are not aware that we are backing this genocide in Yemen. Afghanistan, also, at the bottom we have the picture of Afghanistan, situation of manufactured scarcity, where the US is putting sanctions on Afghanistan to get the Taliban out of power, and that is causing famine for the Afghan people. So, you have a combination of factors here. Obviously, Gaza is another manufactured scarcity situation where the Israelis are putting sanctions on Gaza and causing people to not be able to access food. So again, you've got this combination of factors of, on the one hand, this real scarcity situation coming in of ecological collapse, but on the other hand, the manufactured scarcity of, again, the hierarchical control of resources. And of course, also the hierarchical control of resources causing the climate crisis through its forcing the capitalist system to continue, and specifically animal agribusiness and animal exploitation to continue, along with other industries under capitalism. So we can continue. So we also have, in the midst of all of this, as if this wasn't enough of a nightmare scenario of a future, rising fascism and eco-fascism. And this is in response to both perceived and real rising scarcity. So as the conditions of material scarcity brought on first by the extreme manufactured scarcity of capitalism and even, more extreme versions of it through neoliberalism, and second by the absolute scarcity, the real scarcity of climate collapse, those in the grip of a scarcity mindset increasingly can turn to fascistic or eco-fascistic narratives to explain the crisis, blaming immigrants, Jews, Muslims, people of color, queer people, feminists, disabled people, and others that they see as threatening their access to resources and or draining them. So here in US occupied Turtle Island, the Republican Party is increasingly adopting an eco-fascistic narrative. I've heard this is very much happening in Europe as well. And so maybe the Europeans that are present here can talk a little bit about that if you've heard any of this going on. But certainly, I know that this is a big issue in with these right-wing ultra-nationalist parties in Europe, where they adopt an eco-fascistic narrative to appeal to these younger generations who can no longer afford to be in denial about the reality of climate change and how it will impact their future lives. So instead of denying the reality of climate change, they're looking for scapegoats to blame climate change on. And it's interesting because I've actually even seen, sometimes you'll see, I'm sure many vegans are familiar with this, where you'll actually see the farmed animals themselves being blamed for climate change, as if, it's their choice to be force-bred into existence and to eat up all these resources, and that this is their fault, and so yeah, it's always looking for a scapegoat. Okay, we can continue. So on the idea of post-scarcity, so this idea actually originated with Marx's Grundrisse chapter called Fragment on Machines. He never used the term post-scarcity, but this idea where he talks about this sort of future that moves beyond capitalism, and where, we have all the things that have been produced through capitalism, through the system of mass production, but we don't have capitalism running that anymore. And it continued with the futurist movement. So post-scarcity is this idea of an ideal society that maximizes the production of goods, but minimizes human labor. Now, obviously, we don't just want to minimize human labor, right? We want to get rid of non-human labor. And I would also say we want to get rid of the idea of making the earth labor. That's something that I'm going to give a shout out to a new anarchist theorist, Dan Fisher, who wrote a great paper on that called Total Liberation Pathway. And he has a concept called let nature play that says, well, you know, we shouldn't be trying to make anyone labor. Right? We should basically stop this whole idea of forcing humans to produce, forcing other animals to produce, and forcing the earth to produce. But the idea is to move away from this idea of forcing production so that everyone has an abundance of both free time, but also the things that they need and want to live a happy, fulfilling life. And a healthy life. So post-scarcity does not mean unlimited consumption, but rather that all people can easily have their basic survival needs met, along with some little pleasures and luxuries. In other words, you should be able to have maybe avocado toast, not a yacht.
That really made me chuckle when I read that, Laura. The avocado on toast bit. Nice touch.
Okay, so we can continue. So in 1971, the eco-anarchist Murray Bookchin kind of took this idea in a different direction. And he published a book called Post-Scarcity Anarchism, which melds Marx's view of the post-scarcity society that maximizes production while minimizing labor, thus meeting the needs of society while also freeing everyone up to enjoy their lives, with the eco-conscious idea of a degrowth society that focuses its efforts, not just meeting human needs, but also ecological ones. So, you know, whereas the Marxian idea might be something more like, well, you know, we want to produce at the current scale, you know, but we don't want to have humans having to do it. Let's automate things. But Bookchin was saying, well, wait a minute now. We don't need to keep producing like this. That is actually destroying the planet. And, you know, we have enough stuff. You know, we don't need to keep producing stuff. We need to be looking at, again, this idea of less labor and less production on the whole, not just for humans, but for the earth. And of course, I would add for non-human animals, should not be also used in that way. So he emphasized the role that decreased labor would play in enabling people to take part in a participatory democracy, which is a very key idea in anarchism, thus empowering them over not just the means of production, but also the political decisions. So Roger, I actually watched your talk with Ronnie Lee in preparation for today. And, you know, I was thinking, wow, you know, there are a lot of points here that I want to respond to from this anarchist perspective of participatory democracy, because one of the key ideas of anarchist thinking is that we should not have these people above us that supposedly represent us, emphasis on supposedly, that are making decisions without our influence, our input. So, you know, and one of the reasons, of course, that everyone says, well, we need this system, right? Oh, we can't be making all those decisions ourselves to govern ourselves. We need representatives because people don't have, does anybody have any thoughts on this one? Okay, they don't have time. right? We don't have time for that. We're working. We got to go to work, and everybody's tired afterwards, and there's no time. And nobody questions, but why are we spending so much of our lives working? So Bookchin said, well, wait a minute here. We're working to produce. That's worse for the planet. That's worse for the people. Again, that's worse for the other species. And meanwhile, if we weren't putting all of our time and energy into that, we actually could make our own decisions collectively and self-govern. And we wouldn't need to leave that to somebody else, where again, it's going to be hierarchically controlled.
It's like we're all trapped, isn't it, Laura? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Sorry, Nella. Sorry, Nella. No, you go. I was just saying that we're literally all trapped in this loop, these systems, basically. Go ahead, Nella.
That's what I was thinking. People feel trapped because they are in survival mode to provide for themselves and their families and keep them safe and keep their children fed all the time. So they don't have time for politics. But lately, and I don't know if it is like a wishful thinking or a reality, but I think that lately people are so sick and tired of that, of producing all the time, working all the time, not enjoying life, not enjoying anything. So I see more people in the streets protesting about that, which is hopeful.
Yeah, there's a lot more of that going on now, isn't there? It's kind of people are being pushed to the brink now.
Yes, and I also think, a lot of people have been saying that this is one thing that COVID kind of shook people out of, because there was that long period, longer in some countries than others, but these long periods of kind of like shutdown. And when people were not in that work, go to work every day mode, they started having time to think. And they thought, wait a minute now, why am I spending all of my time doing that? And what about the things that I really value in my life? What about spending time with my family? What about putting my energies into things that are meaningful for me? Why do I have to do that? And that really has put a big dent in this whole, what is sometimes called the Protestant work ethic, or this sort of internalization of capitalist ideals. And so, there's really like a global kind of pushback against that for the first time in a very, very long time. I don't know if any of you heard about the movement in China called the Lie Flat movement, where, and I mean, this is like very unusual for all the youth, a lot of the youth started saying, wait a minute, now why am I pushing myself so hard? And then I'm going to go into this job, and then I'm going to, why? I don't want to do that. I just want to lie flat. Here, of course, we had what was called the Great Resignation, which I find hilarious, because to me, it's like resigning yourself to working yourself to death for somebody else's profit or for things that don't mean anything to you. That's resignation, right? To me, it's like pushback is not resignation. Pushback is, we don't want to do this anymore. We're becoming conscious of this, that there's a problem here. So yeah, I think, again, it's this idea of the crisis happens, and then there can be a shock doctrine against capitalism and against hierarchy. It doesn't always have to be the shock doctrine in the capitalist favor.
It's almost like you were saying about COVID. It's like a pattern interrupt, isn't it? We're in this kind of cycle, and COVID came along and just threw that out, and it does interrupt that ongoing cycle. And it feels like, and I guess in the way climate crisis is a little bit of that as well, isn't it? It's like a massive pattern interrupt, in that we have to really look at now what are we doing? We're in these loops and these cycles. We're trapped in these modes of living that just are not serving either humans, other animals, the planet, or anyone. And it's like, how do we break that, and how do we rebuild something so much better? And this, all these ideas that you're presenting, I mean, that all we can all, I'm sure everyone here can all just kind of visualize these worlds, and it's just that it's that question, isn't it, as this kind of dystopian world that we all want, the amazing future where we're all liberated, and how do we get from where we are now in this scarcity, lack, crisis, fear-based living to that? Like, how do we break this out? How do we take those steps? That's what really fascinates me. I hope you're going to give us some of those ideas, Laura.
And I'm like, oh my
God,
some
hope. Give us some hope.
I definitely will. I'm like, oh, I didn't take notes there because, you brought up like so many different interesting points. And I was like, oh, I got to respond to that. I got to respond to that. So maybe I'll respond in the comments afterwards. But I think that everything you're saying is 100% true. And it's interesting because, when I was watching Ronnie Lee's talk about the influence of anarchism on the vegan movement and the animal liberation movement, and whether that's been a positive thing or a negative thing, he brought up the situationists. And I thought that was very interesting because that was kind of like this anti-consumerist movement that started in the 1950s, where they would do these sorts of like agitprop sort of disruptions to kind of, get people out of that normalization of that consumerist lifestyle. And I will say also that, the consumerism, and he was saying how that kind of like inspired a lot of the animal rights activism that came later because, this idea of disruption, these norms, right? Disrupting these norms. Of course, like direct action everywhere is one that I think a lot of people are familiar with, this idea of disruption. But that goes like much further back. And he was talking about how the Animal Liberation Front used that tactic. But this disruption of the normalization of violence. And, as Roger says, right, normal is violent. And so that's, I think, a key thing that, where animal liberationists and anarchists and, just anti-capitalist movements, they have that in common, is this idea of the disruption. And you're right, like sometimes the disruptions are something that happens out of our control, but at the same time, things that are caused by these destructive actions, right? Like COVID was caused by exploitation of animals, the ecological collapse caused by exploitation of animals and exploitation of systems overall, human, nature, everything. But I also wanted to say that, the consumerism that you were talking about at the beginning of your comment, that's also used as a pacifier to get people to stop thinking about these things, to prevent them from thinking about these things, right? So it's the work. People don't have time to think. But it's also the pacifying of the consumption that stops people from thinking about things. And so another thing that, of course, the COVID disrupted was consumption. And that's why you kind of saw these like massive explosions of distress, was because people did not have their creature comforts as much. And when they didn't have their creature comforts, they didn't know how to handle that because they were not used to a situation where they didn't have all the things distracting them that they usually have, whether that's through work or whether that's through activities that were shut down, or whether that's through things that they consume where there were shortages, because of shutdowns, etc. All of these things are disruptions of this normality where we don't really think about the ramifications of the current system continuing as it's been going. And so I think that, this is a very interesting, important thing for those of us who are trying to change the system to really consider, is how can we kind of help people who are not used to that, to sort of help them, guide them through that process of, not fearing that, but actually seeing that as a pathway to liberation, which it can be if we choose it to be, I believe. So I guess we can continue. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about veganarchism. So this term first appeared in Brian Dominick's 1995 pamphlet, Animal Liberation and Social Revolution. And veganarchism is a green anarchist philosophy and praxis that sees animal liberation as the natural extension of anarchist resistance against all forms of domination, hierarchy, and supremacy. So whether that's human over human, humans over nature, humans over other species, that same issue is at the core of all of them. So vegan anarchism promotes total liberation, which seeks to unite the fragmented movements of human, animal, and earth or ecosystem liberation into a larger and stronger movement. And that's really what total liberation is all about, is bringing all three of these elements together and building that mass movement. Yeah, brilliant. I agree. Great, brilliant pamphlet from Brian Dominick. Okay, so we can continue. So what role can veganism play in ending scarcity? Veganism can play two major roles in moving us from a scarcity-based paradigm to one of abundance for all. So this is the thing, right? Veganism is not just a diet, right? And I think that when we look at veganism in the fullest extent of it being both a practice and a philosophy, it really would, of course, require a total transformation of both our practices and our attitudes regarding non-human animals. This will actually help us move away from scarcity and towards abundance on two different levels. And one is on the material level, and I think that the vegan movement is doing a lot of advocacy on how it can move us away from material scarcity, at least in the most direct senses, right? I mean, obviously the vegan movement talks a lot about how animal exploitation is causing the very climate crisis and ecological crisis that is threatening our survival of being able to have enough of the things that we need. So it is doing that on that level, although I believe it can, and I want to be a part of making it go further. But also on the psychological level, this whole scarcity mode of thinking that we are trapped in, I believe that if we shift our attitudes about the other species that we share this planet with, it will actually help us transition away from that scarcity mode of thinking and into a liberated way of thinking. So let's continue. So how a mass transition to veganism can move us away from a future of absolute scarcity, so real material scarcity, not just the false scarcity that capitalists use to make money, and towards a future of abundance. So obviously, a lot of this is going to be pretty straightforward in the material sense, right? Water. National Water Quality Inventory Report of 2002 noted that agricultural runoff was the leading cause of river and stream impairment and the second leading cause of impairment in lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. Additionally, animal agribusiness uses 20% of the world's fresh water supply. In the US, 60% of the water supply, the fresh water supply, is being used by animal agribusiness. As an industry under capitalism, by far the biggest user and polluter of fresh water. Land. If the entire world went vegan, we would free up a landmass the size of the USA, China, Australia, the European Union, and the UK combined. Or alternatively, you can look at it as the entire continent of Africa, which is a much more massive continent than most people realize, global land use would drop by 75% from 4 billion to 1 billion hectares. And this is something where, there's a natural connection between the vegan movement and land back movements that Black and Indigenous people are working for. And also, of course, species liberation, because when you have that vast amount of land that is no longer being used by animal agribusiness, that can then be rewilded for the other animals that we share this planet with. So this is really something where there's a lot of common ground here between animal liberation movements and veganism and Indigenous and Black land back movements and anarchism more generally, all of which, and really even just the broader left, right? Because this idea of who owns and controls land is at the very core of all of these movements. Biodiversity. By reducing our land usage, we could rewild that land and redistribute it. So, right, I mentioned this in the presentation. And of course, this would also foster wild animal and insect population flourishing, which is essential to the health of ecosystems. Carbon capture, freeing up that land would allow us to plant trees that would capture carbon. Methane, greenhouse gases, consuming animals currently contributes anywhere from 14.5 to 20%. That's the official count. Of course, there have been other estimates much, much higher than that, including the controversial World Watch Institute report put it at 51%. I know Dr. Salish Rao from Climate Healers puts it much, much higher than that even. So there's a lot of dispute, but the official number is still very high. And that's more than the entire transportation industry combined. Right. And then oceans. Manure from farm runoff is the biggest cause of ocean dead zones in the world. And of course, the #1 cause of sea life dying is industrial fishing. Industrial fishing is also causing local populations to starve as they lose their local food source. So,
Laura, can I ask a quick, sorry to interrupt there, I just wanted to ask a real quick question on that particular part of that slide, in that industrial fishing is obviously causing a lot of issues for the local populations, but would fishers still be considered a local food source under a vegan, in a vegan world? So how would we kind of navigate that problem? Because often that is cited as a problem to having a vegan world, is like, some populations rely on, these exploitative practices in order to have food. So yeah, I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And actually, it was something that I was going to address because, obviously, individual fishes' lives matter. Individual marine animals' lives matter, right? So I think this goes back to the thing that I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, which is this scarcity and, veganarchism issue kind of goes both ways, because on the one hand, I do believe that veganarchism can move us away from scarcity. But on the other hand, of course, in order to have a vegan world, we have to have a world without scarcity, right? If people are unable to access sufficient food sources that are plant-based, then obviously they are going to have to rely on whatever and whoever they can eat to survive. So it is obviously a complicated issue where that's concerned. If you have sufficient food that is plant-based for the entire world, then maybe that's not something where that's going to be an issue. So yeah, I would say, that's very interesting, because I'm sure probably all of you have seen Seaspiracy, right? That's a film that really kind of focuses on the issue of the oceans and how they are being depleted by these fishing industries. And they actually, they actually talked about what this was doing to local populations in Africa, because there are, foreign fishing boats that are going to the coast of Africa and killing all the life in the seas. And because people there are not having sufficient food in other ways, I mean, there were people that were like literally starving. What that was doing was that it was then pushing them to actually get more into the bushmeat trade and to start killing land animals. And then because that was happening, that was then causing more zoonotic diseases. And it just set off this whole ripple effect of one horrific thing after another, after another, after another. And so, but we do have to, of course, look at this question of everybody needs to have sufficient food. And so therefore, that is why I'm really a big fan of these vegan mutual aid efforts. And I think that that is really a direction that we need to move further in, because that's answering that question of people not having sufficient food, but doing it in a vegan way. So, for example, in Gaza, actually, there's a big issue with fishing there because there are people that are literally starving in Gaza. The Israeli government is preventing them from being able to access food. And they are attempting to fish off of the waters in Gaza. And then the Israelis are actually, the Israeli military is open firing on the Gazan fishers. So, there are some Israeli animal rights activists, actually, the 269 Life, one of the 269 Life founders, for example, who actually said, well, but that's stopping them from fishing and killing fishes. And so, therefore, we shouldn't oppose that. But, on the other hand, it's like plant the land. The response to that is not to say to starving people, oh, no, don't you go kill any fishes, but to say, hey, there are people starving here, so let's meet that need through vegan food. And let's make sure that people have enough food where they're not forced to do that sort of thing because they have the food that they need. So, yeah.
Laura, if I could take you back to what you were saying about fishing in general, and I remember the Home Project film. I think it made the point there that 1 in 5 people on the planet rely on fishing for survival. Now, do you think that technology like virtual farming can be a solution, or is the technology part of it a problem?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't actually know anything about virtual farming. Can you, but I will say one thing before I forget, which is, so the anarchist way of looking at things where this is concerned, which I think is a really helpful way of looking at things, is we shouldn't necessarily focus the question on technology itself, because the question is who is controlling the technology. So again, when you have hierarchical control, that's going to be a very different agenda that technology is going to be used for, and not a democratic process. Then if it's collective control of the technology. But that being said, of course, as animal liberationists, we have to think about the fact that humans are in the oppressor role over other species, and do other species have a say in how that technology is used? Probably not. So there is that issue to consider beyond the normal anarchist framing of how they would respond to that question. But yeah, so when you say virtual farming, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, to the extent that I understand it myself, it's high tech, but it kind of has got utilizations in kind of low tech kind of scenarios. In the sense that it seems to me that the best thing to do would be to kind of give that kind of technology away in order for people to become self-sufficient. And so, for example, even things like, the kind of ship containers, people have set up virtual farms inside there. So you're talking about LED lighting, you're talking about possibly wind turbines or solar panels in order to power it. So it seems to me that, from what I can gather, the actual initial setup is going to be a problem. So obviously subsidies are going to be involved. But once it's up and running, it seems to me to be possibly the kind of vegan future, in the sense that it almost runs itself in the sense that you're actually getting free energy, and you don't need a lot of energy, because although you need a lot of light and you need control over water, the water use is very small because it's completely controlled. You've got the light is controlled, and also you've got things like you're keeping so-called pests at bay because it's all a very kind of controlled kind of system. So it seems to me that it's a solution to those kind of issues, because you can set up a virtual farm, and like one of the main things that farmers say is, oh well, my land is so bad, and my blah blah and all this kind of stuff. Well, a virtual farm gets around all of these problems as far as I can see. And so even though you might have a community in poverty, if one of these farms can be set up, or a series of these farms can be set up, it would then mean that they can move away from the sea and therefore leave the fishes alone without doing things like bushmeat, because that little scenario that you were talking about before sounds like the worst of vicious circles. In that sense, because you got fishes to bushmeat to pandemics back, and all that, and so it would break all that. But I would think it would need a commitment to set all these things up. And because, as usual with these things, I think it's the initial setting up of things which is the problem. So it almost would be like an aid thing, that you would give all this equipment to them, and then to make them self-sufficient rather than perpetually dependent. So from what I've seen, it's a very kind of useful idea, at least for us as vegans to pursue, or at least to carry on researching, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I actually heard George Monbiot speaking about something kind of along those lines, where he was saying that there's a way to kind of like micro brew plant-based proteins. And that this was something that actually, I have to look into this more, because I only just heard about this recently and I'd never heard of it before. But he was saying that it's something that does not need to have any sort of centralized control of production, that it's something that local people all over the world could do. And they would be able to kind of like brew their own protein-rich foods, which would be pretty amazing. Because it would not be.
I think it would. I think it would feed into the anarchic idea of mutual aid, in the sense that what you would have is you need people to become trained in maintenance of these farms, and so therefore, again, you would imagine situations where people will be bartering bits and pieces and all that, and kind of not. I don't mean kind of make do, but kind of like, running repairs. So it wouldn't be a kind of, oh, it's broken, throw it out type technology. It'd be, based on repairing it and all that kind of stuff. And so it just seems to me that from what I've seen so far, it really is a grand solution for many kind of problems, not least the farmers who do generally have very poor land. Well, that gets around that problem for a start.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think it's interesting to combine that with, some of the anarchist ideas.
Sorry, it looks like I misspoke. Yeah, I didn't mean vertical farming, not virtual farming.
Oh, you did mean vertical farming. Oh, okay. I am familiar with vertical farming. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and actually, yes, I think vertical farming has a lot of interesting potential. And the other thing I was going to say is that I think that could be combined with something that is happening that is more of I don't want to necessarily say anarchist, but communalist, which is kind of like a very much in alignment with, we'll say, anarchism or even a strain of anarchism in some ways, but movements where farmers will kind of come together and say, well, I can produce this over here if you can produce that. And that way we can become food sovereign as a community. So that's something actually that I was hearing they're doing in Venezuela, because the sanctions made it impossible for them to rely on imported food service sources. And so the farmers actually got together and they started kind of like deciding collectively who was going to produce what. And I think that that would be very interesting in terms of like what you're talking about of, different types of plant foods that could be produced in different locations and stuff like that to make a population food sovereign.
Well, I think we also would need to be critical about the actual category of farmer. I mean, maybe in an anarchic world, everybody would be a farmer, wouldn't they?
Totally agree with you. Yeah. I mean, and in an anarchic world, right, everybody is going, number one, there are not going to be these like, designated positions, because there would be no class society, right? So it's not like, oh, you're the person that's going to be doing the farm labor and somebody else will be doing something else. Right. Everybody would be learning how to produce.
Yeah, because if you maintain specialism, that's what gives you power, and that's what gives you the ability to create scarcity, right? And so you would need to kind of think past and through that system completely.
Mm-hmm. Especially where the things are concerned that are basic human needs, because you can have beyond that somebody that has a particular interest or area that they want to focus on. But when it comes to the things that everyone needs to survive, yes, there should not be this thing where only certain people have the knowledge of how to do that. And the others then are beholden to them to provide that skill or that service or that knowledge. And on the flip side, of course, it's not like any one group or class of people should have to do the labor to provide for the rest. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
This comment I think is interesting, Laura, in the sense that Linda is saying the problem is the human condition, but I think in an anarchist view of humans is that it's generally optimistic, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting that Linda says we are primates, because that's not a bad thing, right? That's a positive thing, that we are primates. And, we can look to, again, like I was saying earlier about Kropotkin and, many others that have kind of taken that direction since him. This idea of, wow, let's look at the other primates. In the way of virtual farming would be easy. In the
I
way
don't think I'm ever going to live that one down. I don't think getting that one.
No, you won't be able to.
like for when we look at other primates, we can see a lot of things that I think actually would be very aspirational for us at this stage in our development. That they have an understanding of communalism, of cooperation, of mutual aid and solidarity and non-hierarchy and all these amazing things. So, I mean, the fact that we're primates is not an indication that we are just pathological and there's no hope for us. I think it's actually the opposite.
I want to mention something about food sovereignty. You mentioned a while ago, Laura. I was thinking that even in regions like the Mediterranean, for example, where people could be food sovereign because some years back they would produce everything they needed in order to survive. now they cannot with import-export laws and the European Union laws. Now this knowledge and this ability and the control of seeds is lost. So even in areas that this would be super easy in the past, it has become difficult now. And of course, this is not a coincidence. It's something that was purposefully done by the governments, or anyway, those who control.
Yeah, exactly. And I also wanted to mention, first of all, this virtual animal freedom activist. The comment about bonobos, right? Bonobos really exemplify a lot of the qualities that we're talking about. They're kind of like total anarchists in that very cooperative and harmonious sense, strong social community. I can also talk about some really amazing things with other species of primates that really show, kind of these traits that are very much in alignment with the anarchism and the solidarity communities, the non-hierarchy, etc. One in particular that just absolutely blew my mind, where they did this study with gibbons, and it was actually kind of like an experiment that was done on humans that some people may be familiar with. It's very famous. It's called the Milgram experiment. And in the Milgram experiment, Stanley Milgram made human volunteers that came in for this research study think that that somebody was getting like a shock treatment, and he tested to see if people would be willing to administer this shock treatment to the other person under certain circumstances of being kind of coerced to do so, and found that the vast majority of the people that he tested were willing to administer the shocks. And then they did a similar experiment with gibbons, where the one gibbon was led to believe that their actions would harm another gibbon, and that the only way that they could get food was if they did this action. And I was absolutely blown away by the results of this study, because do you know what the gibbons did? They went on hunger strike.
Yeah, it happened with rats as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that too, yeah.
They went on hunger strike for an average of 11 days.
Wow.
They refused to do the thing that would hurt the other gibbon, and they starved for 11 days because they were unwilling to do it. So when we talk about humans being primates, it's like that's definitely not a sign that we don't have these qualities in us. To me, that is a sign.
They were only virtual gibbons, though, Laura. So, and I also, before we go, I want to point out in my notes that I did write down vertical farming. It's just
It's the COVID order.
Yeah, we want vertical farming. We don't want vertical organizing. That's, for people who are unfamiliar, that's a big thing in anarchist theory as well, is this idea of only horizontal organizing, because there should be top down, right? Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is just on the note of the local food supply and the fishing issue and the supplying food and all this sort of thing. Another thing that would be very significant in moving to a veganarchist society would be an end to, again, centralized control of land, or centralized control of resources, of food supplies. So, there's kind of like this idea of, you would have to like provide, like manufactured, vegan specialty items or something to, people in these parts of the world, for them to have a sufficient food supply, to not have to do things like fishing. But I think it's important to keep in mind that under a veganarchist world, there wouldn't be that denial of access because there wouldn't be that power structure of hierarchy that there is now. So again, it's such a different way. It's almost hard to conceptualize because we're so stuck in this hierarchical setup that we can't even imagine a world where people wouldn't be, let's say, forced to engage in fishing or hunting or, you know, other forms of animal exploitation, because they would have everything available to them. There would be no one stopping them from accessing what they need.
Sounds amazing.
So, do we have more slides, Laura?
I think there are more. Are there not more coming up? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so changing our scarcity mentality through veganarchism. So we have this funny little picture of Darwin chasing after the animals with a fork and a plate. So our ideas about human nature, so-called, stem directly from our ideas about animal nature, right? This is just what we were talking about with this comment about, you know, we are primates. It's like, but what does that really mean? Because we've been led to believe that primates have a very different nature than they actually do, and in turn that we do as primates. So if we believe that animals at heart are selfish, ruthless, greedy, competitive, etc., that's how we will see ourselves and how we will see other humans, in addition to seeing other animals that way. These ideas have served capitalism and false scarcity very well, because by transforming our perceptions about other animals, by respecting their sentience, their compassion, their cooperation, and their personhood, we begin to see these traits in our fellow humans as well. So, you know, for example, what we were talking about earlier with, you know, some of these kind of like more fascistic responses to scarcity or perceived scarcity on the horizon, or the preppers, even, I can bring them into it, right? It's very much this idea of, I got to take mine because I can't trust those around me, and it's dog eat dog, and it's survival of the fittest. And all of this is rooted actually in our ideas about and relationship with other animals. So when we perceive other animals that way, it causes us to perceive other humans that way and to perceive ourselves that way, and to continue to operating in that capitalist construct of the so-called law of the jungle. And it keeps us in that scarcity mindset and mode of operation. So we can continue.
Well, I'm just thinking about the time, actually, Laura. What is there a lot to go, or?
No, I think we're right close to the very ending.
Ah, right. Okay, we shall continue then. Yeah, sorry about that. I just thought I'd check.
So
just a virtual check. It was not
Yeah.
not a vertical check.
Right. Valuing animals, a key to overcoming the prison of scarcity in our own minds. Their freedom is our freedom. So a 2012 study by Gordon Hodson and Kimberly Costello at Brock University in Canada suggests, and common sense confirms, that valuing humans and valuing animals tend to go hand in hand. There appear to be close links between how much moral value we accord to animals and how much we accord to other humans, especially those who are different from us. In particular, racial prejudice has close ties to prejudice against animals. And of course, I did include an image of Mutual Aid, which is the book I mentioned earlier by Peter Kropotkin. It is really a foundational anarchist text. And it's interesting to me that this is hardly ever mentioned, that, again, the inspiration for that in large part, not exclusively, but in large part, was observing non-human animals and how they operate their societies in this very anarchistic socialist way. So yes, we can continue. And So yeah, we have scarcity versus abundance. Under scarcity, of course, we have uncertainty of survival. We have competition, desperation, mistrust, misery, hoarding, blame, war, death. And then we have the other route that we can go, which is the abundance. And that is inherent access to the necessities of life. And again, I'm going to say for all species, not just for humans. And that is the way of collaboration, confidence, trust, prosperity, but not economic, financial prosperity, but collective prosperity, sharing, responsibility, peace, and life. Obviously, this is an enormous topic. I could go on and on about how the left-hand side relates to what we do to other species. But you can kind of have your imagination go from there, right? How does the subjugation of other species relate to again, this hierarchical overall way of being in the world? So yeah, I think that's it, right?
Yes, there's no more slides.
I have
Yeah.
one last question for Laura. It seems that in order to achieve that and make more people see what you were explaining all this time, is that people around us that get some kind of validation by being higher in the hierarchy, and not
Yeah.
even that high, just higher from someone else,
Mm-hmm.
can change their outlook, because this is like,
Thank you.
in my opinion, what stops us. Not only the people at the top, those that control everything, but the people around us, like everyday people who have to work, who face problems, and yet they feel comfortable in their small scale roles just because they have just enough, a little more than the other person. And sometimes, especially this time of the year, they even get more validation, but by giving something to those less fortunate. So how do we go to resolve this problem?
Such a good question. Yes, exactly. So, I was thinking about this recently because it's kind of a funny way to start thinking about this, but I was thinking about this in terms of used books, actually, because my mother was, wanting to give gifts, and she had ordered some books, and then it was from a used book supplier, but actually she wanted the books to look new, and then they didn't look new, and then she was concerned. She said, oh, I can't give these as gifts. And it's funny because I was thinking about that, and I was like, how odd that people would rather have a used that they would rather have a new book than a used book, or that there's this idea that would be insulting to give someone a used book, because logically that wouldn't make any sense, right? The book is readable. Why would you want to cut down a tree to create a book? And so I was thinking about kind of this idea of it's almost like this feeling of, oh, what? I wasn't good enough to cut a tree down for? You're going to give me somebody else's used book? And of course, that kind of led me to start thinking about this issue with other animals, because this is really, I do believe, at the core of this really kind of like aggressive resistance to veganism, even when the food tastes exactly the same. There is a sort of underlying psychology of, oh, what? I wasn't good enough to sacrifice an animal for. And if you really think about that to where, its logical conclusion leads, it's this idea of, I want to be treated like a god. I deserve to have animals be sacrificed for me. Other people are having animals sacrificed for them. Why am I any less? So it's warped, right? But my feeling on this is that I think that you have a lot of people that are feeling very disempowered in the world under the systems of hierarchy and domination, capitalism, of course, but also other forms of hierarchy. And so again, it's kind of like, because they feel degraded, belittled, etc. by that, they're looking for some form of supremacy and domination to make them feel powerful again. And if you had a world where you didn't have that starting point, I feel like there wouldn't be that need then to dominate others, because that comes from, again, a feeling of lack, right? Scarcity again, but scarcity in the sense of power. I have a scarcity of power, and so I'm looking to then exert power over others to feel more powerful because I feel disempowered in some other way. So I don't know, that would be something that I would kind of want to think about in terms of resolving that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an interesting view.
Great answer.
I think for some people it's going to be like that. We'd hope that that wouldn't be a universal human value, because that would be difficult to get over. But I do understand that that's exactly the resistance you get, even though, because I always say a vegan version of anything is superior. If I start off, there's no rights violations in it, and so that automatically makes it superior as far as I'm concerned. But even if they were to think, well, this is 10% inferior, so you're gonna cause all that for 10% difference, So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Nell is onto something, that it really goes further than that, where it's kind of like the domination is the point, right? It's not about finding something, even if it tastes exactly the same and it's convenient and it's cheaper and everything, there are a lot of people that are resistant. And so we have to go into the deeper reasons why.
It's so true. People automatically will just say things like, but that's what they're here for. What's the point of having cows in the fields if we're not going to eat them? Do you know, it's well, that's what they're here for. That's what, and then it all goes back to that, apex predator, we are the top of the food chain, that whole hierarchical narrative that we have, we're the dominant species on the planet, we have control. It very much is dominant.
It goes back to the functional thing that we've talked about several times on the show, in the sense that this is often why this thing about why love one and eat the other doesn't quite work, because their attitude is, well, one is to be loved and one is to be eaten. That's their function. And so if we orientate towards others in a functional sense, then just getting them to juxtaposition doesn't necessarily work.
I have to say, there's a term that I recently heard that I'm now like obsessed with, because it just explains the problem with everything, which is instrumentalist. So, basically it's like we're all operating under this instrumentalist way of thinking that we've been conditioned into in this sort of capitalist, colonialist society, which is this idea that everyone and everything has to serve some sort of exploitative purpose, that everyone and everything is a means to an end, right? So, well, why would cows exist? If they're not meant to be eaten, then what's the point of them? Why do humans exist if we're not meant to, labor for others? What is the, this land is going to waste. We should, put it to work. We should put it to use. All of this is kind of that same ideology manifesting, which is the devaluation of life as having inherent value in and of itself. This idea that it always has to lead to some sort of product, some sort of profit. This is really at the root of everything that is wrong here. And if we can help people to understand that this is at the root of their subjugation and exploitation, that the capitalists are looking at them and saying, well, why do these people exist if not to produce wealth for me, if not to produce services for me, if not to serve me? Then maybe that can lead to them understanding that that is the case, of course, for other species as well, not just for us.
Yeah, one of the Frankfurt School explored instrumental reason quite a lot. In fact, I've got a lecture about it, and I started off with a quote from Hans Royce, The Slaughter of the Innocent, where this guy was apparently joining rats together experimentally, and he was asked what was the purpose of it, and he said, well, I don't know what this might do for humanity, but it's going to get me a PhD. And so he just totally looked at the situation totally instrumentally. And, you know, I mean, like one of the crude examples is rather than seeing a tree, you see, you know, a ream of paper. And so, you know, you look at the world as an instrument, including each other. And that is one of the most destructive ways of being, I think.
Yeah, and I have to add also, you know, I mentioned colonialist, you know, in addition to capitalist ways of thinking as well earlier. And, you know, the reason why this is very significant to colonialism specifically is because when people are coming into a land that they are not rooted to, you know, very often they will come in with, or I would say pretty much always actually, they'll come in with an eye for what can I get from this, because they don't have that long-term relationship with the land and the other species that live on it. So, you know, when you have like colonialism and imperialism, you know, there's a really strong relationship there with this idea of everyone and everything is there to be exploited for the colonizers.
Yep. And time is to be exploited, but time has also beaten us, I'm afraid, people. And so we've just coming up to 2 hours. So Laura, well done for talking for that length of time. It was really fascinating. And
and she didn't even have a drink either. You didn't even have a drink of water, Laura, did you?
No.
Well done.
It's great that we were able to finally provide a platform for this important talk. So I'm pleased that we've been able to do that.
Great, Laura. So brilliant. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
It's so empowering and optimistic, because usually we explore the problems, but when we explore solutions, I mean, it's pure joy.
And I want to actually, on that note, give a shout out to the communalist movement. Because actually I have been getting very involved with that movement. And this past summer, I spent a week in Vermont at an event called Eco-Socialism from Below. And I met people who are actually working in their own locations to build this new communalist system that is based on the principles of mutual aid and non-hierarchy. And, you know, they're building a network that is global of these local communities doing this on the ground level. And I think that we really need an animal liberationist vegan contingent of that movement, because that is something that I think, you know, that's really an answer to a lot of the issues that we are trying to resolve here. So if you are a vegan and animal liberationist that is watching this, or even if you're not, but you believe in these ideas and you want to get more involved in them, I would definitely recommend looking into communalism and eco-socialism from below, and an organization called Symbiosis Revolution that is building this network of these small organizations on the ground all over the world.
Great. I'm just chuckling away here, thinking presentation by Laura Schleifer and questions from Wendy, Nella, and myself, and sound effect slurping by Dylan in the background there. So,
oh, did you?
Yes, appearances from Wendy's cat.
Cat, no, No, Dylan's the dog person here, Laura. Brian's gone off. He's having his grub, I think. I've got to go and do his injection. But yeah, Dylan the dog. I don't think you've met Dylan, Laura. You've yet to meet Dylan.
Oh, you wouldn't forget if you had, Laura. Don't worry. So
Nella definitely hasn't forgotten.
Oh my God, yes.
In the flesh.
Right, people. It's dead on 2 hours, so this is a brilliant time to finish. And thank you so much again, Laura. Thanks everybody in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your questions, Nella and Wendy. And we shall see you again, and have a good break if you are into that type of thing. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks everyone, and people are saying love Laura, and we all love Laura too here, don't we? So
yes.
Laura, you're welcome back anytime.